welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources and materials you're curious about and, well, we boil them down to the key takeaways for you.
Helping you get informed without drowning in information.
Exactly. And today, we're looking at something really interesting, maybe a bit obscure. John Stuart Mill's essay on social freedom.
Ah, yes. A fascinating piece. Most people know Mill for On Liberty, the big one about government power and individual rights.
Right.
But on social freedom, this later essay, it wasn't even published in his lifetime. It shows a real evolution in his thinking, maybe even some contradictions when you put it next to On Liberty.
It really does. And it had this unusual publication history, didn't it? It finally appeared in this short-lived journal, the Oxford and Cambridge Review, I think way back in 1907.
That's right. And Dorothy Fosdick, in her introduction to the 1941 reprint we're looking at, she points out that because of this and the scarcity of that original journal, the essay just kind of fell off the map for a lot of political thinkers.
Which is a shame. So our mission today, let's say, is to really unpack the core arguments in this neglected essay.
And see how they maybe refine or perhaps even challenge Mill's earlier, more famous ideas about individual liberty and its relationship with society.
Okay, let's get into it. So On Liberty, that was 1859, right?
Correct.
And its main focus was, well, drawing lines. Limits on what the government or society acting like a government could do to the individual. Civil liberty, social liberty, that was the term.
Exactly. It was about protecting the individual from external power, primarily state power. But on social freedom, which seems to have been written, shortly before he died in 1873?
Yeah, likely quite late in his life.
It tackles something different. It's less about political limits and more, sociological, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. The full title kind of gives it away. On social freedom, or the necessary limits of individual freedom arising out of the conditions of our social life.
Right there. It's about the limits that come just from living together. Not just laws, but the very nature of being in a society.
Which feels like a move away from that strong individualist focus you see in On Liberty, and like Fosdick mentions in thinkers like Hobbes or Adam Smith before him, this idea of humans as sort of fundamentally separate.
Right, as primarily self-regarding, isolated beings. Mill, in this essay, really starts to push back against that.
How so? What's his argument for us being inherently social?
Well, he gives two main reasons. First, it's just practical. Our material needs. We simply can't survive, let alone thrive on our own.
Is this where that thought experiment comes in? The one about being completely isolated?
Precisely. Imagine, he says, being cut off entirely for, say, a year and a half. No help from anyone, just you and nature.
Sounds pretty bleak.
It would be continually miserable, as he puts it. Your only freedom in that situation. Mill's phrase is stark. The freedom to starve.
Wow. Okay, so basic survival forces us together. Absolute individual freedom is sort of an illusion then, because we depend on others.
That's a key takeaway. We rely on each other fundamentally. But the second reason goes beyond just material needs. It gets into our desires, our motivations.
Well, we want out of life.
Exactly. Mill points out that many of our desires are inherently social. They're about our standing relative to others. His example is quite pointed. Men do not desire merely to be rich, but to be richer than other men.
Keeping up with the Joneses, basically.
Or just the simple need for companionship, for recognition, for being part of a shared system of values, Our desire for social connection links our own sense of self and freedom to the group.
Okay, so if we accept that we're fundamentally social beings, needing each other practically and emotionally, how does that change his view on liberty and, well, the constraints society places on us?
It changes it quite significantly. He starts to look beyond just legal or political controls. And on Liberty, there was maybe a tendency to lump all social control together with political coercion, with law.
Treating social pressure almost like a law.
Something like that. But here, On Social Freedom, he makes a crucial distinction. He argues that maybe we're barking up the wrong tree, focusing only on laws.
You mean other things limit our freedom more?
That's exactly his point. He says it's a fallacy, even a mischievous and absurd one, to think that the main limitations upon men's freedom are owing to oppressive or unjust laws.
That's a really strong claim. So if it's not mainly laws, what is the bigger threat in his view here?
It's the non-political stuff. Public opinion, social expectations, what he calls conventional propriety.
Conventional propriety, like the unwritten rules. What's considered done or not done.
Precisely. the things we do or don't do because, well, that's just how things are. He did touch on the power of custom in On Liberty, sure, but here he really hammers home that these invisible social pressures, this sort of vague consensus, often restricts us much more powerfully than any actual law.
Okay, so this leads him to critique that whole idea of dividing life up neatly, doesn't it? The individualist theory of freedom.
Yes, the notion that you can just carve out these separate spheres of activity where each individual is totally sovereign, completely free.
Why doesn't that work, according to Mill here?
Because our desires and actions inevitably clash. They spill over. He uses some quite vivid examples.
Like the hat example, the guy who wants the freedom to wear his hat during the national anthem.
Right, and the other person who wants the freedom to knock it off, to bonnet him, as Mill puts it.
Okay. Or the freedom to speak your mind versus someone else's freedom to, well, shout you down or prevent you from speaking.
Exactly. It shows that even seemingly self-regarding actions have social ripple effects. One person's freedom in their supposed sphere directly impacts another's. You just can't draw these neat little lines around individuals. Life's too messy, too interconnected.
And does this rethinking also apply to the value of liberty itself? In On Liberty, freedom seems like this almost absolute good. Does he question that here?
He starts to question whether all exercises of freedom, even seemingly self-regarding ones, are necessarily good for the wider community, for the public good.
He gives some quite uncomfortable examples, doesn't he?
Very. He talks about the freedom for someone to morally pervert or cruelly treat their own children, or for a man to beat his wife.
These are stark examples challenging that idea that anything done in private is automatically okay or beyond question.
Right. He's suggesting we can't just put certain actions in a box labeled private sphere and say absolute freedom applies here no matter what.
Right.
We have to consider the consequences, the potential harm, even if it doesn't directly violate a specific law aimed at someone else.
This feels like a significant shift. Then he gets into this really complex bit about freedom being related to our motives. Higher versus lower motives?
Yes, this is a tricky, maybe even controversial part of the essay. He suggests that the degree of freedom we experience in an action is connected to the quality of the motive behind it. He argues that when we act from what we perceive as the highest motive available to us, maybe duty or a principle we truly believe in, we experience a greater sense of freedom. Conversely, acting from lower motives, even by choice, feels less free.
Can you give an example he uses?
Sure. Think about voting. If you vote based on your conscience, your considered view of the best outcome, that feels free. But if you vote a certain way because, say, your landlord pressures you or because you want to curry favor.
Even though you're still choosing to vote that way.
Exactly. You're making a choice, but Mill suggests it lacks genuine freedom because it's driven by fear or social pressure or self-interest. In a narrow sense, these lower motives. Same for maybe concealing your true opinions to just fit in and maintain social standing.
Okay, I see. It's about the why behind the action affecting the feeling of freedom.
Precisely. It connects to his broader ethical ideas, obviously, about higher and lower pleasures and aiming for the general good.
And this ties back nicely to that idea of conventionalism, right? This powerful, unseen authority.
Absolutely. This is a central theme on social freedom. Mill really emphasizes the immense power of conventionalism or conventional propriety. This fear of being different, the strange and vague dread, as he puts it, of doing what no one else ever does.
He argues this is stronger than law.
Much stronger, often. It dictates so much of our behavior, more subtly but also more pervasively than the civil law ever could.
And he links the feeling of obeying these conventions, even voluntarily, to obeying the law.
Yes, he draws a parallel. Just like choosing to obey a law you disagree with can feel like a constraint, choosing to follow a social convention you don't believe in just to avoid disapproval or awkwardness also diminishes your sense of freedom.
Like going to that tedious social gathering you feel obligated to attend, or maybe avoiding contact with a relative deemed unsuitable by your social circle.
Exactly, those kinds of things. They might seem like small voluntary choices, but Mill argues they contribute to a significant feeling of unfreedom, of being hemmed in by expectations.
So pulling this all together on social freedom really shows us a Mill grappling with the deeper, more social dimensions of liberty. It's not just about the state anymore.
Not at all. He's moved towards a much more sociological understanding. He sees the limits that society itself, through its norms and expectations, places on the individual. That's a huge takeaway. Society's invisible rules matter, maybe even more than written ones.
And he's questioning those earlier, perhaps simpler individualist ideas, recognizing our deep social interconnectedness.
Yeah, realizing that desires clash, that actions have ripple effects, that you can't just draw neat lines. And he's reevaluating liberty not just as an end in itself, but considering its impact on the community, on the general welfare.
And really highlighting the power of these unwritten rules of conventionalism, of public opinion.
And how that pressure, that voluntary obedience to norms, can seriously chip away at our sense of real freedom, even when no law is involved. The crucial point is that feeling free isn't just about what's legally permitted.
It really makes you reflect, doesn't it? What are the non-legal constraints shaping our choices today? How much are we influenced by, say, social media trends or workplace culture or just the fear of looking odd?
Exactly. Are there conventions you follow, perhaps without even thinking about it, that might actually be limiting your autonomy in ways you haven't considered? Is online culture a new, powerful form of this conventionalism Mill was worried about?
That's definitely something to chew on. This has been a fascinating look into a less known but really important part of Mill's thought. We definitely encourage you to explore his work further. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.